Terry and I are taking a brief break to conduct interviews for Season 7 and to secure more funding. Please enjoy this episode from our archives.
And we'll be back in mid-November.
Yes. Hello, and thank you for joining us on Giving Voice to Depression. I'm Bridget.
And I'm Terry. More than 350 million people worldwide suffer from depression, but you do not have to have it yourself to be affected by it. Its prevalence pretty much guarantees that someone you care about battles its darkness.
This podcast tries to shine some light into that darkness. We're not experts, and we're not therapists. We're sisters and best friends who live with depression and are committed to encouraging healthy, healing conversations about mental illness.
Episodes in this season are made possible by a grant from the Charles E. Kubly Foundation, which is dedicated to bettering the lives of those affected by depression. Hi, Bridget.
Hi, Terry. The world's leading researchers have determined that one of the most effective ways of erasing stigma of mental illness is for people with lived experience to tell their stories of recovery. I love that. People with lived experience to tell their stories of recovery. Hiding our mental health experiences often leads to shame. Telling our stories can replace that shame with a sense of authority and empowerment. Bring it on.
Absolutely. Today's guest does bring it on. Mark Hennick is the embodiment of that finding. His early life was one of struggle, stigma, and multiple suicide attempts. After being literally pulled back over the rail of a bridge by a stranger during what he calls his last attempt, Mark made the choice and did the hard work to become a person who pulls others back, gives them hope for another chance at life, by sharing his intimate and true story to let us all know that recovery and happiness really are possible, even for people who have been literally over the rail.
In last week's episode, Mark debunked some of the myths of suicide for us, and today he shares his own personal story. Mark also has a TED Talk about his experience, which we'll link to in this episode, and you might want to check out. It's called Why We Choose Suicide, and it's one of the most watched videos in the world, having just broken 5 million views. And views are real people, you know, people who are listening to it. It's so wonderful how he's turned it all around to help people. His story resonates with people because it's true, and it's relatable, and it's hopeful. Here's Mark Hennick giving his voice to depression.
Mark first started dealing with depression and anxiety when he was in elementary school and could still show his age by holding up his fingers.
And then by the time I got to 12 or so, things started to get a whole lot worse. And, you know, growing up in a small town, especially as a boy, it wasn't the type of thing that we talked about. Certainly not then. I mean, it's barely something that we talk about now, although we've come a long way.
Even without words, mental health struggles often make themselves evident. One indicator is a change in school or work performance.
Because it turns out when all this stuff is happening in your head, your attention is like a spotlight. You can only point it at one thing at a time. And if it's so focused on your anxiety and depression, other things are going to start to fall away.
Mark vividly remembers that spotlight being blinding during a test at school.
So instead, what I did, since I didn't know any of the answers and my mind had completely blanked out, I started doodling pictures in the margins of the empty test. And I drew 10 different ways that I could kill myself. And that was the first time that the stuff that had been happening inside me ever came out in some way, ever was expressed. I didn't ask for help, but it was certainly a cry for help. You know, you can't bottle those things up forever. They're going to come out eventually in some way.
And as you might expect, that caught the teacher's attention. But neither she nor the guidance counselor she sent him to were trained or equipped to handle the situation. Mark ended up in the hospital, where he was determined to be suicidal. And while it would be wonderful to be able to say young Mark was properly treated, medicated, and counseled so he could live happily ever after.
Yeah, I wish I could say that was super helpful. I think most people who have received, or, I can only really talk from my personal experience, but from what I've heard in doing this, most people who go to hospital for acute psychiatric treatment, that's not what suddenly leads to their recovery. People with mental health problems don't get better in that way, or at least they don't get cured in hospital. Hospital is a way to keep people safe. And actually, oftentimes, as happened with me several times after that, it can be really quite traumatizing, actually.
Between the ages of 12 and 17, Mark made several suicide attempts, leading to several more trips to the hospital.
Until eventually it culminated into finding myself on the edge of a bridge late one night where I had a plan to jump. And if it wasn't for a complete stranger who arrived and who actually physically grabbed me when I let go of the railing and pulled me back, if it wasn't for that, I never would have survived, certainly. So when you're in this place of emotional scarcity, that's the only thing you can focus on, is getting your needs met in whatever way possible to be able to relieve yourself of this burden. And for me, since I had no other tools, the thing that I became fixated on was suicide. And now I almost think of it as becoming addicted to suicide in some ways, because I had no other coping mechanisms. Nobody had ever taught me any other coping mechanism. So it wasn't that I wanted to die for death's sake. It's that I didn't want to live that way anymore, and I had no idea how else to get out of it.
But because of the environment you were in and the time you were in and the state you were in, and I don't mean the state on the map, I mean the state in your mind, You didn't see this as a failure of the system. You saw it as a failure, a further failure of yours?
Absolutely. And especially once you become, as they say unflatteringly, a frequent flyer in the mental health system, which is when you come in and out so many times because you're not getting the help that you need, you start to think that you're unhelpable, that you're fundamentally broken and different, and that you'll never be redeemed. So it actually ends up making it worse in many ways. And by the time I got to my last attempt, that's exactly how I felt. I felt like I had reached out for help in the only ways I knew how, that nobody could help me. And actually, by that point, by the end, I thought that everybody had just written me off, that, I'd never amount to anything, that all the newspapers and media reports were telling me that I was probably going to grow up to be a serial killer or a rapist or an arsonist or some other criminal, which, of course, people with mental health problems and illnesses aren't any more violent than anybody else. Actually, they tend to be victims of violence more often, but that's not the narrative that you hear. So by the end, I felt like if doctors even can't help me, then nobody can.
But after that stranger pulled him to safety, something in Mark shifted. He chose to be, and now is, like that stranger, a person who gets behind people and reaches out to help them survive.
That's what I've been doing ever since, once I found that purpose to share my stories about attempted suicide, about the struggles of my depression and anxiety, to really use that to break down the stigma, which then gives people permission to speak up and speak out. And that's what's given me the purpose that's kept me alive, I think.
So it's from that perspective we asked Mark what we can do as adults, as parents, as a society to make the world a safer place for those of us with mental health challenges, starting at a young age.
Almost everywhere, it seems like, the community's approach to suicide prevention is to building fences and means restriction, it's called, on bridges, and putting phones on bridges. Essentially, I think of it as, and don't get me wrong, that stuff is necessary, it does work, but it's like lining up the ambulances at the bottom of the bridge. That's a necessary part of the system, I guess, but we need to be preventing people from ever going there in the first place. Because once you open up that cognitive pathway in your mind, once you unlock that way of thinking, it's very difficult to unthink about suicide. I've long since achieved a good place in my recovery, and I've learned so much from these experiences. But I can't forget that I used to be suicidal. I can't just grow that pathway over in my mind again. It would have been helpful had I never built it in the first place.
So Mark advocates for early intervention, way upstream.
Teaching kids about their emotions, for example, how to name and label their feelings, how to cope with stressors and emotional distress in more constructive ways. These are all really basic skills that we can teach kids from a very early age that can help to avoid these things much further downstream.
And do you believe that if you had been able to say, had perhaps even known how to say, I'm having very dark thoughts, I'm stuck in this loop, I think something's wrong, that if your parents or any other adult had responded in what I'll judgmentally call an appropriate way, that it would have ended differently for you?
I think it would have helped. On one part of me would say, well, avoiding trauma would be a great way to avoid the mental health problems that result. But realistically speaking, if we're not able to prevent all bad things that happen to everybody, then giving them the tools more effectively to deal with those, giving them the safety to work through these kinds of issues. And we're still really not doing that. Why isn't there mandatory mental health education in every school? Since we know that it'll impact your productivity, the way that you work, how effective you are. It'll reduce how much of the healthcare system you use. It'll reduce police interactions. Just if we give people a better understanding of their emotions and how to better manage and handle them. So I think there are systemic ways to help people that we're still not doing as well.
So I asked that question right back. Why isn't there mandatory mental health education in every school?
It's a long-term investment, and in certainly a political landscape that happens in 4-year or 2-year cycles, or even just perpetually political. I don't think that people really have that long view that if we invest in elementary age kids or in prenatal care, even to go back that far, that it's going to have benefits 20 years downstream, 30, 40 lifetime benefits downstream. I don't think most politicians who are holding the purse strings are exactly thinking that far. And I think that's the real tragedy, because life happens in long term. It doesn't happen in election cycles.
A real tragedy, because resilient parents raise resilient children. And if we start teaching and talking about mental health and coping strategies and how to support ourselves and each other, that will impact generations to come and could, and I don't say this naively or lightly, could change the world.
So I think that if we were to do that, if we were to invest in this kind of generational shift, I think you're right. It would reverberate around the world, change eventually our companies, our schools, our politics in that way, as people who are more resilient and more mentally healthy start to age. That's not about avoiding struggle. It's not about avoiding every bad thing that might happen. It's about learning how to deal with it better. And that's what resilience is. Resilience isn't avoiding struggle. Resilience is bouncing back from struggle. And right now we need to be able to help people do that.
So if anyone listening is aware of a program or organization that's successfully working toward that goal, please let us know and we'll profile it in a future episode. For now, though, we'll return the focus to ourselves, which we can work on right now. One of the reasons we reached out to Mark, before we even realized he was that TED Talk guy, is because he wrote an article about getting really good at depression. Do tell.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that for some people, recovery is something that happens 100% right away. You're cured. Hallelujah, move on with your life. That seems to be the minority of people. It certainly hasn't been my experience. I take medication. It happens to work for me. I also do therapy. That combination approach is generally the best approach. But I also leave room for the fact that I'm going to relapse from time to time. I'm still going to have hard days. And everybody has hard days, but I'm still going to have days and weeks, sometimes months of depression and of anxiety where it actually interferes with my life. However, knowing that, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm uncurable anymore. In fact, I've actually been able to turn the tables on it and say, I've gotten through this before. Why wouldn't I get through it this time? And actually, every time I get through it, I learn a little bit more each time about what helps me to recognize that it's coming on, what helps me to get out of it. Sometimes it's just a matter of patience, realizing that, this is going to be a tough couple of weeks, and that's okay. It's allowed to be a tough couple of weeks. I have depression. That's how it goes. So I think it helps to give you perspective. It helps to shorten the relapses, I think, knowing that you actually have more power over this thing than you think you do, and that it just may be cyclical in nature. It may be episodic in nature, and that's okay.
Not okay in a welcomed way, of course, just a realistic one. And then Mark implements the coping strategies he's learned work for him.
Well, first of all, recognizing that it's happening, I think, is key. And that seems like a simple thing, realizing, I'm depressed again. Well, it's actually not, because one of the functions of depression is that blinding effect. The depression doesn't want you to know that it's coming, because then you might do something to make it go away. It's sneaky that way. So I think recognizing, I haven't been quite myself for the last few weeks. I wonder what's going on here. I'm withdrawing more. Part of it is recognizing what your individual manifestations of your diagnosis are, too, or whether or not you have a diagnosis. For me, it's withdrawing more, becoming more irritable, eating differently, less healthily, for sure, interacting differently with people. So when I start to notice that trend happening, that shift from my baseline, that's the first step to then starting to implement some of my recovery strategies. I can give myself more time to complete tasks, for example, so I can focus on them better. Paying attention to my sleep, making sure I have a great, or at least a better sleep routine, that I'm going to bed earlier, that I don't have my phone on my nightstand and checking it late into the night, that I'm making a point of leaving the house at least once a day. Making some of these small changes in my life that maybe have gone off the rails as a result of my depression. And then if necessary, and this has happened a handful of times, if I need to go back and talk to my doctor potentially about a change in my medication, or if I need to onboard some therapy for a while. There have been many instances where I've done that for anywhere from a few weeks to a few months. It's all getting a sense of how stuck you are in that moment, and then how big of a chain you need to get pulled out of that stuck place.
Oh, that is so worth repeating. It's all about getting a sense of how stuck you are and how big a chain you need to get pulled out of that stuck place.
So, I think that when I say grinding it out, sometimes that's just it. Realizing that, it's going to suck, but it sucks less over time if you give yourself patience and space to do that, and have the metacognition, you have the higher level thinking enough to be able to realize that every struggle doesn't have to be the last struggle, that this too shall pass. And maybe that's faith. I don't know, not having the evidence to support that things will get better, but believing it anyway. And I think that played an important part in my recovery, certainly in the early days. In my case, I was literally pulled off a bridge, but it's not like I then went to the hospital and found this amazing medication that changed my life, or found this great therapist who unlocked all the secrets of happiness for me. It was actually a slow accumulation of positive reinforcement, I think. Finding things that I was passionate about, being positively reinforced for that, and then repeating that cycle over and over again for years, until eventually you don't realize how far you've gone until you actually stop and look back. You don't realize that you've recovered right away until you look back and realize, hey, it's been 15 years since I stood on the edge of that bridge, and I actually like my life now, and I'm actually happy.
Let those words sink in, because we need to know, we need to believe that someone, including us, can go from where Mark was to where Mark is, liking his life and actually being happy. Remember that. Everything can change.
Another thing that Mark said that I really liked was that people with mental health challenges have a responsibility to others to show people what it means to have a mental illness and to debunk the stereotypes.
Wow. Well, he certainly walks the talk.
He also describes things in a nuanced way that just is very resonates as truthful to me. And an example of that was his description of his own experience earlier on was, my mind was running, screaming, shaking, and closing in on itself again.
Whoa.
I know, isn't that so accurate? Closing in on itself. My perception had become constricted and darkened and collapsed. I felt like an asthmatic who had lost my glasses in a hurricane.
I've seen that line. Yeah, that's intense. And that's one of the things we intend to do with this podcast, and say it in, I don't know if it's the open or the close every week, but that one of the goals is to get language to explain it better to ourselves, to our doctors, to our partners, to, whomever we're trying to, and that is really helpful.
Exactly. And the insight that it does ebb and flow, and it might resurface again, but today it may not feel that way. There's so much hope in that.
Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful message, and we are very grateful that he chose to share it with us and our listeners.
Absolutely. And we'll link to his TED Talk at the bottom of this.
Mm-hmm. So thank you again, Mark. Thank you, Bridget. And we'll be back next week. Bye. Bye.
We hope that these shared stories bring out a little more understanding or help people articulate their experiences of depression a little more clearly or more freely. Thanks to everyone who's digging deep and finding the words and finding the courage to give voice to depression.
You can find all the other episodes, some resources, and a blog on our website, givingvoicetodepression.com. And you can find the podcast most of the other places that you find podcasts. Just Google it, as our mom says.
And please remember, if you're hurting, speak up. If someone else is hurting, listen up.